Last time we spoke about the conquest of Northern Manchuria. The outbreak of violence all over Manchuria and even across the Amur River resulted in a full-scale Russian invasion. Beginning in Northern Manchuria, the Russians gradually advanced across the border to first secure endangered Russian pockets of civilians and forces, but soon cities all over Northern Manchuria were being seized. The Chinese attempted many offensives, but instead of consolidating a large force to defeat each Russian army, they performed numerous simultaneous operations. Alar, Tsitsiar, Kirin, and Haichung all fell one by one. Manchu generals were dying on the battlefield or committing suicide as Russian detachments ran incredibly fast and effective campaigns. Although the Russian string of victories were grand, the Manchu had more forces, more war materials, and they were fighting for their homelands. The Russians would need even more reinforcements if they were to take the south. This episode is the Russo-Chinese War Part 4, the Conquest of Southern Manchuria. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. Before we begin, I just want to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Want to watch something on the sillier side? Check out my brand new episode on What If Godzilla Attacked Japan in 1947. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for more exclusive podcasts. The fall of Haichung gave Mishinka's men a period of much-needed R&R. The number one objective, Mukden, could not be taken with the forces at hand. Thus, the Russians would need to wait for large reinforcements coming over from Europe. For 43 days, the men remained active, but they were restless. Everyone was awaiting the arrival of Lieutenant General Subai, commander of the Russian forces for the Guangdong region. Cossack patrols scoured Manchuria, speaking with local Manchu contacts whom they had known for years. Intelligence in early September indicated 50,000 well-armed troops with 60 Krupp artillery pieces, some Maxim machine guns, and Nordfeld machine guns were defending the way between Liaoyang and Mukden. Subai reached Haichung on September the 21st, and he would have at his disposal 47 companies, 2.5 sotnyas, and 28 artillery pieces, roughly 90 or so men in all. The Chinese had numerical superiority, and they wielded modern European weapons with vast amounts of war supplies. But the Russians were now acutely aware the Chinese lacked discipline, marksmanship, and leadership. The inhabitants of Manchuria had lost faith in their defenders. The Mongols had all but abandoned them. A lot of the towns now saw their Manchu bannermen as opportunistic plunderers, and they began to hide provisions from them. A lot of the towns, upon seeing incoming Russian forces, would hoist white flags to the dismay of the local Chinese troops. Chinese militiamen were gradually dissolving back into the populace, abandoning the regular troops. Subai received such intelligence and would use it to his advantage. He made a proclamation in early September. Notwithstanding the repeated orders of the military command and the imperial sovereign's desire, proclaimed to everyone, under no circumstances, to burn down villages. There are scoundrels who do not hold dear the Tsar's will, and have no regard for other people's property, acquired by sweat of peasants. Chinese though they may be, such scoundrels will be shot. With this, Subai won the important psychological victory, for the Manchurian populace were clamoring for peace, and at the dismay of their Manchu defenders. Subai understood the actions of his enemy as months of campaign information were given to him. The Chinese forces were aggressive until they met Russian advances, whereupon they typically fled. Whenever Russian halted advances, the Chinese would regroup and attack, and this kept going on in cycles. Thus, to truly end the enemy's will to fight, it would be necessary to pursue them and not let up, depriving them of any opportunity to regroup. Subai planned a three-pronged defensive. A central force would attack Anan, a western force would hit Nuchuang, and upon defeating it, it would envelop east to hit Anan as well. The eastern force, more light and mobile, would get around the enemy to cut off their retreat. On September the 23rd, the western force advanced upon Nuchuang, led by General Fleischer. They consisted of the 1st, 2nd, 11th East Siberian Rifles Regiment, 2 sotnias of Verkhnuding's Cossacks, an infantry battery, a platoon cavalry battery, and a mobile section of the Red Cross. Around Nuchuang were 6,000 Chinese led by General Shu. Nuchuang was surrounded by mountains that could conceal troop movements. General Shu had chose not to defend the city and instead had his forces perform harassing operations. On September the 24th, General Fleischer entered the city, and now General Shu expected the Russians to make a camp at Nuchuang for some time. So he made his own camp only 4 miles away, hoping to perform some more harassing actions. However, General Fleischer left only a small garrison, and he carried on immediately to hasten the envelopment of Anshan, where 14,000 Chinese were entrenched. Fleischer's men came upon Shu's quickly, and this led Shu to scramble into a retreat which turned quickly into a rout. The Chinese planned to withdraw eastward into the Qinshan Hills to allow the Russians to go past towards their main force located at Xiaohou. They thought that they would come back down the hill and hit the Russian rear, but now they were fleeing directly towards Xiaohou, bringing the Russians into their own camp. Mounted Cossacks managed to get 2/3 of Shu's men to scatter in all directions, thus only 2,000 of his men would actually reach Xiaohou. Meanwhile, Colonel Atramanov, Subai chief of staff, rode out personally with 2 sotnias to perform a reconnaissance of Anshan's defenses. They rode along the fortified heights, forcing the Chinese to open fire from a distance as he sketched the Chinese artillery emplacements. He soon figured out the Chinese had stretched their line going some 4.5 miles. Their right flank leaned into a hill and their left flank to a fortified temple. Their trenches were arranged in tiers and held some 14,000 men and perhaps 30 artillery pieces. At 5:30 a.m. on the 26th, the Russian main force was advancing in 2 columns towards Anshan. The central column, commanded by Atramanov, consisted of the 13th and 14th Rifle Regiments, 2 companies of the 15th East Siberian Regiment, 3.5 batteries, a machine gun battery, and a platoon of Verkhnuding's Cossacks. The right column, led by Mishinka, consisted of 2 companies and 2 sotnias of railway guards, and 4 guns of the 1st Transbaikal Cossack Battery. Mishinka's force was taking a northeast approach going through Tatun, Anshan and the Anshan Pass. He faced no resistance, and he was soon 4.5 miles ahead of the main force, so he decided to wait in the Anshan Heights. Mishinka was personally going up the hill to look for a route to bring his artillery up when suddenly the eastern hills exploded with artillery shells and rifle volleys. To the Russians' surprise, the Chinese had taken to the hills to ambush them, and now they could see Manchu bannermen galloping down the slopes as they bellowed their horns. The Russians hastily took up positions, and Mishinka was unaware how large the enemy forces were, so he ordered Stakov and Denisin to dislodge the Chinese from the heights. Mishinka assumed 2 Cossack sotnias would be up to the task, each merely 40 men or so. The 80 men charged up the hills unknowingly into the very center of over 14,000 Chinese. Mishinka sent the rest of his detachment up the hills, and this time the Russians faced a real opposition. The maelstrom of gunfire was so intense, the Russians believed the Chinese were attacking them also from the rear. Then, unexpectedly, the Chinese began to fall back, clearing the hills. Only rearguard firing was to be seen. It would turn out the Russians had panicked so much, their own forces began firing on forward units, leading them to believe the Chinese were behind them during the short engagement. Mishinka began burying the dead as Orlov joined them with the sections of the Red Cross to tend to the wounded. The Chinese had pulled back northwards towards the Sha River, intending to lure the Russians into a huge horseshoe formation formed around the village of Xiaopu. at the top of the Chiechan Hills on the west and east. Together with reserve forces at Mukden and the remnants of the scattered Nuchuang detachment, the Chinese had planned to make a grand stand. Now on paper, the Russians had no chance to defeat the Chinese position. They had 53,000 men, guarding a 8-mile-long horseshoe perimeter. However, 3,000 of General Shu's men failed to make it, and 14,000 men of the Anshan force arrived too late to join the battle effectively. Yet despite that, the Chinese main force was 30,000 strong, absolutely dwarfing the 18.5 companies and 2 satnyas that were employed against them. The Manchu commanders faced another major problem, one that was all too common for the late Qing dynasty's armies. The Chinese battalions had been full strength on paper during peacetime, whereupon commanders were pocketing half or more of the salary funds. When the hostilities broke out, they hastily refilled their forces with just about anybody that they could grab, and this would account for the poor marksmanship and discipline. There were boys of 15 and men over 50, many bandits who joined eager to plunder but not to fight. With the Russians quick on their heels, General Shu only got to the Chinese defensive lines on the eve of the battle. Various commanders had positioned their men at their own discretion, as far away as possible from the expected point of attack. General Shu attempted to tighten the overextended lines, but many commanders refused to accept his authority. Allegedly, many commanders stated, "Why would we listen to a man who runs away from battle?" General Shu's rash beheadings of several officers because of this, just prior to the outbreak of a battle, did not have a good effect on morale. In fact, his attempts to reform the lines properly actually just added more confusion when the battle started. The Chinese lines were so extended, the Russians lacked the numbers to effectively hit the front and flanks. Subai elected to begin the battle with an artillery duel. His artillery was on his left flank initially, but he quickly moved it to the middle and he began pounding each part of the Chinese lines, one after another. Meanwhile, his infantry continuously gunned into assembly positions awaiting a breakthrough, probably in the center. At 6 a.m. on the 27th, Mishinka went out with his 2 companies, 2 satnyas and 4 guns to hit the enemy positions in the Anshan Heights near the Liao and Sha rivers. He discovered Chinese positions along some mountains. He took his own artillery up a mountain, which would later be called Mount Mishinka, where he began an artillery duel. Suddenly, his railway guards were being surrounded by Chinese infantry. Grenades and bullets were being tossed just about everywhere. The Chinese were coming in waves. Mishinka had made a real blunder. He thought he was attacking an outpost when in fact he was fighting in the midst of over 30,000 Chinese. From the very tip of Xiaohupu, some 4,200 feet away, Chinese artillery were firing upon his artillery. The artillery firing grenades were sending shrapnel everywhere, causing bloody carnage. The Chinese artillery were firing effectively, casualties were mounting, and Mishinka's artillery ammunition was beginning to run out. Mishinka believed his detachment's days might finally be over, but the Chinese did not press their attack. The Chinese continued their bombardment, but they did not release a death blow with their infantry. Enough time passed by for Atramanov to arrive to the sector with a vanguard at about 11 a.m. Mishinka's artillery was joined by Atramanov, who also handed over much-needed ammunition to help him out. Together they now held 12 guns, and they both fired upon the Chinese, and the gun duel was tipping in their favor. It seems the Chinese did not realize how small the force was that was facing them, and only pressed their attack when Mishinka received reinforcements, so they had lost their opportunity to overrun him. Mishinka and Atramanov pushed against the Chinese center. General Subai, viewing this unfold, unleashed a flank attack, and by mid-afternoon the Chinese had been dislodged from their formidable position. By nighttime, the Chinese were again fleeing for Lianyang. Some of the best Qing commanders lost the battle at Xiaopu, such as Generals Yun, Fun, and Xu. They were unable to control their men, who scattered into the countryside and began plundering. The commanders were mortified at the breakdown of discipline, and they took the men that they could and they went to Mukden. Once they reached Mukden, they tendered their resignations to Beijing. Instead of defending the Manchurian capital, or trying to negotiate its surrender to preserve what could be preserved, the generals went to work gathering every cart and wagon they could to plunder the banks and treasuries of Mukden. They deserted their troops, allowing them to simply scatter across Manchuria and Mongolia. The Northern Manchurian detachments headed for Mukden, Tailing, Fukumen, like a swarm of marauders plundering every town and small village along the way. It would be mostly units formed in the Liaoyang provinces that actually stood their ground against Suboitich's advance. Suboitich's patrols reported that the Chinese were entrenching themselves on some hills halfway between Xiaopu and Liaoyang. At 6:30 a.m. on the 28th, General Fleischer advanced with his column trying to get around the right flank and storm the western face of the Liaoyang fortress. Meanwhile, Mishinka departed with his column at 8:20 a.m., going through some mountains to get across the left flank and hit the eastern gates of the Liaoyang fortress. And the center column of Colonel Atromanov set out at 8:30 to make a frontal assault. The Chinese sent Manchu cavalry to harass the vanguards of the Russian forces, but Cossack sabers were winning the engagements heavily. Many of these Manchu cavalry units would put up a fight, then rush to the nearest village to hide among civilians. Atromanov's path took him to a central part of the Liaoyang walls. Atromanov set up his artillery to batter them and distract their attention from the flanking maneuvers. At 2 p.m., Fleischer approached the western walls. The defenders fired only a few shots, killing around 7 Russians before fleeing eastwards into the mountains. On the other side of the nearby river, Russian artillery were beginning to pummel the walls, forcing the Chinese to abandon many of their modern Krupp and Nordfeld guns. Once Fleischer was mounting his attack, Atromanov ordered his men to storm the central position, driving the defenders towards a village from which many were trying to fire upon Fleischer's position. Now finding themselves attacked from 2 simultaneous fronts, the Chinese began to flee, abandoning more and more artillery pieces. In around just 30 minutes, the Russian flag was hoisted over the fortress, and Atromanov's men wasted no time pursuing the fleeing enemy. Mishinka, meanwhile, kept up his bad luck of running directly into heavy opposition. His column was advancing through some mountains, and again, unable to see past some heights, he ventured into a large force, this time of 6,000 Chinese. The Chinese were those who had fled to Xiaopu. They feared being encircled, so they took up a very overextended line. When Mishinka saw the Chinese forces, he had his artillery rapid fire before tossing 2 companies to drive the Chinese deeper into the mountains. With orders not to pursue the enemy any further, Mishinka turned to Liaoyang, where his exhausted men got a day's rest. The Russians had only reported 10 deaths and 64 wounded for the battle. Again, they noted terrible accuracy by the Chinese riflemen to be the reason for such low casualties. They also noted many Chinese artillery shells did not explode, so one can expect that corruption was again to be a factor. The Russians found the barracks they once defended and graves of their fallen comrades dug open with the remains tossed everywhere. The Russians were livid at seeing such a thing. They took all the remains that they could find, reburied them that very night, and with full military honors. Constantine was at the scene, and upon seeing the undug graves, he began an investigation. He interrogated some recent POWs, and they told him some very gruesome details. They stated that their former comrades had been held at the Liaoyang jail. They were given foul water and stinking excrement for food, and they were beaten until they ate it. Their wounds were not cleaned nor bandaged, and they had rampant infections. They soon began to smell so bad, the Chinese guards began to complain. The Chinese jail commander had those with festering wounds decapitated. The prisoners were routinely forbidden to lie down to sleep, unless they used the severed heads of their comrades for a pillow. After a few days, many of the men used the heads for pillows. Many Chinese drew silly faces upon them and made them kiss piglets all over for humiliation. They were tortured horribly. Many of them had their limbs cut off slowly, and they bled out. With a wild anger in their hearts, the Russians now looked towards Mukden. Lieutenant General Subai wasted no time advancing the men to the cradle of the Qing dynasty. Mukden at that point had a population of around 200,000, and it constituted a major commercial and industrial center for Manchuria. The city was surrounded by 11 miles of outer earth wall and an inner brick wall with towers and gun ports. It was around 3 miles in circumference. Intelligence indicated there was a lot of friction between Northern and Southern Manchuria at this time. While Liaoyang had offered strong resistance, Mukden was expected to be a cakewalk. One captured Qing officer told Subai, "If our forces were unable to defend Liaoyang, they will simply abandon Mukden." The final offensive began on September the 30th, and it would be spearheaded by Colonel Mishenka, now reinforced with the 5th Verkhnudings Cossack Satnya and a scouting party of the 11th and 14th Rifle Regiments. Next would be Colonel Dombrowski, with 3.5 battalions of infantry, 16 artillery, 4 heavy machine guns, sappers, and a squadron of Cossacks. After that would be the bulk of Suboitic's army. The Russians advanced along the Imperial Highway without any opposition. The Chinese were completely demoralized after the endless string of defeats. Inhabitants of the villages along the way told the Russians the Chinese soldiers had been deserted by their generals, and they were withdrawing into the countryside. They also said at first the Chinese soldiers only took food from them, but soon this became open plundering of anything. It seems the Russian proclamation that they would not lift a finger on civilians had a side effect. The villages began denying food to the Chinese troops, and this led to conflict. There, of course, were many Russians who plundered the Chinese, but most would think of this as depriving the enemy. Upon seeing what the enemy was doing to its own citizens, the Russians were filled with further hate. Many of the Chinese villagers would rush up to the Russians, giving them chickens, vegetables, and eggs, which only strengthened the Russian troops' mindset that the enemy soldiers needed to be defeated quickly so their citizens could live a life of peace again. Another Chinese officer, POW, told the Russians Mukden was not going to be defended, and in fact was probably burning down as they spoke. The Russian advanced quickly. Mishenka ordered the 8th Don Cossack Satnya of Pudisal, led by Denisov, to rush over to Mukden to see if the rumors were true. The intelligence would prove accurate. Mukden was abandoned. However, there was a catch. The Chinese planned to blow up Mukden and the Russians within it. The Manchu had placed mines with electrical wires through countless buildings, ammunition dumps, gates, and private homes. The entire population was chased out of the city before any of this was done, trying to keep it utmost secret. The Manchu generals expected the Russians to attack Mukden on October the 2nd. However, they were so busy plundering and mining the city, the commanders neglected to post guards on the walls. So when Denisov's patrol showed up on October the 1st, the gates were still wide open. When the Chinese mounted patrols caught sight of the Russians, they began firing upon them from the outskirts of the city. The mounted Cossacks simply ignored them and galloped through the southern gates of Mukden, sabering through sentries. They quickly occupied a tower that was part of the southern wall and opened fire on the Chinese tents down below. The Chinese frantically began running as the Cossacks butchered anyone that they saw. The Chinese soldiers were in a state of panic, firing randomly at anything that looked like an enemy. The Cossacks were attempting to make it seem like they were a much larger force than they actually were, charging through streets wildly. In the distance, Atramanov and Mishenka were closing in on the city, and they could see their comrades were occupying a tower and firing upon the Chinese. With excitement at seeing the bravado of their comrades, they rushed forward. Han, Manchu, and Boxers were seen fighting each other for horses trying to escape the city. However, in their flight, the Chinese forgot to detonate the mines. At one of the gates, boxes were buried with powder and phosphor matches, and some of the Cossacks galloped over them, igniting the matches and exploding the boxes upon the last Cossacks riding past. 6 men were killed, but in comparison to what the Chinese had actually planned, it was a rather small price to pay. At around sunset, Constantine arrived, and he occupied one of the 8 gates of Mukden's fortress walls. Cossacks ran through the city and its outskirts, pushing out the Chinese to pacify the area. Entire quarters of Mukden were up in flames, as the Chinese had burnt down all the parts they could as they fled. The imperial palace was saved, surprisingly. The fall of Mukden did not end the war over Manchuria. The Chinese did not surrender. Many scattered back to their villages, others became raiders, continuing to attack both Russian and Chinese. Russian forces in Manchuria and Peijuli grew to 3,900 officers and 173,000 men. However, with Mukden taken, there was no longer a need for such a grand force, and demobilization gradually began on October the 3rd. The Manchu general of Mukden eventually sent word to General Subai from Mingting that he would be willing to enter peace negotiations. He laid blame completely on the Boxers for the entire conflict, asserting he had done everything humanly possible to avoid the violence and to, quote, preserve the centuries-old friendship between Russia and China. He implored the Russians to continue their anti-bandit campaigns. The Honghuzi had been a problem long before this conflict. Honghuzi literally translates to the Red Beards. They were armed Chinese bandits who operated on the eastern Russian-Chinese borderland during the late 19th to early 20th century. For decades, they plundered the countryside, defying the Qing authorities. They became so organized and strong, Qing officials would often find it necessary at times to make deals with them. This was seen sometimes by supplying them with foodstuffs or occasionally bestowing military ranks upon their leaders. When wars occurred, their ranks would swell. They had countless hideouts, and the Russians found them to be quite the annoyance. The war had deeply impacted the harvests in Manchuria. Numerous fields were not tended to properly, and the population was greatly suffering. As hunger began to stalk the land, the Manchu Railway transported large quantities of grain donated through charities to try and help out. The Russians never attempted to directly rule over the government in Manchuria. They had garrisons in major cities and dominated key officials as advisors. General Tsarpitsky, commanding the forces around Mukden, and a subordinate Colonel Grovetsky, advised the Manchu general of Mukden this: the duties of the colonel are broad and demand much tact in the continuous cooperation and frequently opposition of the two authorities, Russia and Chinese. He must play the role of a buffer. There was some economic stimulus to Manchuria from the Russians. Mukden was quickly rebuilt, markets expanded. The Russians helped police wherever they had interest. In most of Manchuria, the Russians could do whatever they wanted, excluding Yinko, which held an international settlement. War Minister Alexei Kuropatkin sought to ensure the good conduct of Russian forces in Manchuria, and he ordered General Grudakov and Admiral Alexeyev, see to it that the troops do not coerce the population in any way. With the last shot of the battle, the life of the natives, their honor, property, and customs must be inviolate for our troops. Russia was well aware the other great powers resented their occupation and influence over the region. One power, in particular, the Empire of Japan, was not happy with the situation. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Want to watch something a bit more silly and insane? Check out my recent episode on What If Godzilla Actually Attacked Japan in 1947. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel for more exclusive podcasts. And so the Russian Empire had consolidated its foothold in all of Manchuria. 177,000 Russian troops were now stationed within the breadbasket of Asia. Under the guise they were only there to protect some railways. But what if they decided not to leave?